The first time they crossed my property line, I called it a mistake. The second time, I called it disrespect. The third time, I stopped calling it anything and started collecting evidence, because where I come from, a man who keeps stepping over the same fence is not lost. He is testing how much of you he can take before you finally push back. My name is Walter Cade, and I lived on 68 acres outside Dry Creek, Oklahoma, for every one of my 67 years. The place was not fancy, never had been, just red dirt, blackjack oaks, stubborn cattle, and an old limestone house my grandfather built with his own hands after coming home from Korea. Developers saw empty land when they looked at it. I saw my mother hanging sheets on the line, my father teaching me how to repair wire with frozen fingers, and my wife Ellen laughing on the back porch before cancer took the strength from her voice. There are places a person owns, and then there are places that own a piece of the person. That ranch had most of me. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late April, when the sunrise came up orange over the eastern ridge, and the dew made every strand of barbed wire shine like silver. I walked down to the front gate with a chipped coffee mug in one hand and my old border collie, Amos, dragging behind me like he had already worked a full shift. Wedged between two cedar rails was a white envelope so clean it looked unnatural against all that dust. No stamp, no return address, no name on the front. Inside was a single sheet of thick cream paper with one sentence printed in the middle. Briar Glen expansion cannot move forward while the Cade tract remains occupied. Under that, in bold letters, it said, "Vacate voluntarily." I read it twice, mostly because the first time I figured age had finally caught up with my eyesight. Then, I turned the page over, expecting a signature, a company logo, anything that would tell me which coward had paid extra for good paper but could not afford to sign his own threat. There was nothing. Amos sniffed the envelope, sneezed, and looked at me like even he thought it smelled dishonest. I spent the next hour walking the fence line. No tire tracks, no obvious boot prints, no broken brush. Whoever had delivered it knew the property, knew where the security light did not reach, and knew how to step across dry ground without leaving much behind. That bothered me more than the letter itself. Loud people want to scare you. Quiet people usually want to surprise you. I tried to go on with my day, but those two words followed me everywhere. Vacate voluntarily. They sat beside me while I repaired a cracked trough. They rode with me on the tractor. They stood in the barn while I counted feed sacks. By noon, I had decided one thing. Nobody was going to move me off that land while I was still breathing. And if someone had already made plans that required my disappearance, then they had made one expensive mistake. The next morning, I heard a drone before I saw it, a thin mechanical buzz circling above the south pasture. When I reached the fence, 3 men were standing along the county road wearing bright survey vests, clean jeans, and boots that had never met manure. One held a laser rangefinder. Another was setting up a GPS tripod. The third was pushing orange flags into the ground, and one of those flags was planted 6 feet inside my fence. "Morning," I called. None of them answered. Around Dry Creek, people wave at strangers they do not like, so ignoring a man on his own property takes effort. I walked closer. "You boys lose the road. Or are you charging extra to trespass today?" The tallest man finally looked up. He had mirrored sunglasses and the flat expression of someone who had been trained to speak politely while doing something crooked. "Preliminary boundary verification," he said. "For what?" "Briar Glen Section 6. I leaned against the fence post. "Briar Glen ends half a mile east of here. Not according to the proposed realignment." "Proposed by who?" He tapped his clipboard. "County Planning and the Briar Glen Community Association." That was the first time I heard the phrase proposed realignment, and I will tell you, nothing good has ever happened after a stranger uses 3 words to explain why your land might not be yours anymore. The younger surveyor looked uncomfortable. He glanced at the flag, then at me. "Sir, we were told the northern portion of this tract was under acquisition review." "You were told wrong." The tall man gave me a smile so small it was almost an insult. "We are within the public access corridor. Anything visible from here can be documented." I looked at the tripod standing beyond my wire. "That equipment is not in the corridor. Neither is that flag." He did not move it. Instead, he looked past me toward the pasture, studying the slope where my cattle grazed. That was when I noticed a rolled set of plans tucked under his arm. A blue corner stuck out, and on it I could see the shape of a curved street. They were not checking a boundary. They were drawing houses over my grass. I stepped through the gate, pulled the orange flag from the dirt, and handed it back to him. Tell whoever hired you that the Cade line has not moved since 1962. If they think otherwise, they can come explain it themselves. The men packed up slowly, trying to pretend I had not rattled them. As they reached their white SUV, the youngest one said something I do not think he meant for me to hear. Without this parcel, the whole section is dead. The tall man told him to shut up, but it was too late. That one sentence explained the envelope, the drone, and the confidence. Somebody had already built a future on top of my property, at least on paper, and now my continued existence had become a financial problem. 3 days later, that problem arrived at my porch wearing a navy blazer, polished brown shoes, and enough cologne to make Amos retreat under the table. His name was Preston Vale, acquisitions director for North Star Residential Partners. He smiled like we were old friends, placed a leather folder beside my coffee, and looked across my north pasture as if he were deciding where to put a swimming pool. "Mr. Cade," he said, "you have a remarkable piece of land." I nodded. "That is why I kept it." He laughed, though I had not made a joke. Then he opened the folder and slid a glossy rendering toward me. It showed a gated neighborhood with stone entrances, walking trails, a decorative lake, and 42 luxury homes. Right through the center ran the creek where Ellen and I used to sit on summer evenings. "Your land is the final connection point for Briar Glen Section 6, Preston said. "We have already secured investor commitments, infrastructure financing, and preliminary reservations from buyers." I studied the drawing for a long moment. "You sold houses on my ranch?" He shifted in his chair. "We marketed the concept subject to acquisition." "That sounds like yes with the tie on." His smile tightened. "We are prepared to make a generous offer, enough for you to relocate comfortably and avoid a prolonged dispute." "Relocate where?" "Somewhere easier to maintain, maybe closer to family." I stared at him, and for the first time he seemed to realize he had stepped into a conversation he did not understand. "My family is buried on that hill," I said. "My wife is buried under the cottonwood by the creek. So when you say closer to family, Preston, you are already standing there." He closed the folder halfway. "I respect the emotional attachment, but progress does not stop because one person refuses to adapt." "No," I said quietly. "Progress does not stop. It just finds land that belongs to somebody willing to sell." He stood, gathered his papers, and left one contract on the table. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and said, "The association has options beyond a private purchase: environmental review, access easements, even condemnation if the county sees a public benefit." That was the moment the whole thing changed. He was not negotiating anymore. He was warning me. I watched his black SUV disappear down the road, then opened the contract he had left behind. Every signature tab was already marked. Every deadline had already been scheduled. And buried in an attachment near the back was a map showing my northern 40 acres under a new parcel number, one that did not belong to me. I carried that contract into the kitchen and spread every page across the table where Ellen used to roll biscuit dough on Sunday mornings. The new parcel number appeared 3 times, once on the development map, once in a financing schedule, and once in a preliminary title summary that listed Briar Glen Community Association as the controlling party. That was not a clerical error. Somebody had created a paper version of my ranch where I no longer existed, and they had used that fiction to borrow money, attract investors, and sell homes that had not been built on land they did not own. I called my county recorder, a woman named Jeanette Crowley, who had known my family since I was a teenager, and asked her to pull every filing connected to my legal description. She went quiet for a few seconds, then said, "Walter, there was a boundary adjustment submitted 11 weeks ago." "By who?" "Briar Glen Community Association, supported by a private survey and an affidavit of abandoned agricultural use." I nearly laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. "Abandoned?" I asked, looking through the window at 36 head of cattle standing beside a working windmill. Jeanette lowered her voice. "The affidavit says the northern tract has been unoccupied for more than 5 years and lacks active fencing or maintained access." I looked at the mud on my boots, then at Amos asleep beside the back door. Apparently my cows had become ghosts. "Send me everything," I said. "And Jeanette, do not alert whoever filed it." She understood. By 4 that afternoon, I had copies of the affidavit, the altered plat, and a survey bearing the seal of a man named Lowell Brandt. I knew the name. Brandt had lost his surveying license 2 years earlier after falsifying floodplain reports for a shopping center outside Tulsa. Yet there was his seal, freshly stamped, declaring my fence line uncertain and my pasture unused. The signature beneath the abandoned land affidavit belonged to someone named Harold Cade. I had no relative named Harold Cade. They had invented a family member to surrender land I had never abandoned. The following morning, 2 vehicles arrived at my gate. A white sedan and a black utility truck with Bradley Glenn Community Service printed on the side in letters large enough to look official from a distance. A woman stepped from the sedan wearing a cream-colored suit and narrow sunglasses. She introduced herself as Vivian Sloan, president of the Briar Glen Community Association, though her tone suggested I should already know who she was. Beside her stood a heavy-set man in a gray uniform with a plastic badge that said Community Compliance Marshal. He rested one hand near his belt as though hoping I would mistake him for law enforcement. "Mr. Hell, Mr. Tatring, Cade," Vivian said. "This gate interferes with a designated emergency access corridor." I took a sip of coffee. Funny, it did not interfere with anything yesterday. Circumstances evolve. The community is expanding, and your property has been identified for integration into the regional safety plan. Integration, I repeated. That is a pretty word for taking something without asking. Her smile stayed fixed. "We are trying to avoid conflict." "No, you are trying to avoid paying for a lawsuit you already earned." The uniformed man stepped forward. "Sir, we need access to inspect the drainage channel and assess environmental hazards. You need a warrant." "We are not a police agency," he said. "Then stop dressing like one." His cheeks reddened. Vivian removed a folder from her bag and handed me a notice claiming my cattle fencing violated neighborhood appearance standards. My barn roof created visual blight, and my livestock posed a sanitation risk to nearby residents. The nearest Briar Glen house was more than half a mile away, separated from me by a county road, a creek, and enough common sense to know a ranch smells like a ranch. I read the notice and looked up. "You are fining me for failing to match a neighborhood I do not belong to? Adjacent properties are subject to community impact provisions. You people really do charge by the syllable, do you not?" Her expression hardened. "Mr. Pear, Cade, Grapin, Northstar has already invested heavily in this expansion. Families are counting on these homes. Jobs are at stake. Roads have been approved. Utilities have been scheduled. One stubborn landowner should not be allowed to hold an entire community hostage." There was the story she had told herself. I was not a man defending his home. I was a selfish obstacle standing in the way of families, jobs, progress, and all the other noble words people use when they want something badly enough to steal it. I stepped closer to the gate. "Vivian, you've sold promises built on my land. That does not make me your hostage taker. It makes you a liar with a cash flow problem." The compliance marshal shifted his weight, and Vivian leaned toward me just enough for her perfume to mix with the dust. "The county can condemn unsafe or environmentally compromised property," she said softly. "Old irrigation systems fail. Fuel tanks leak. Cattle contaminate waterways. Things happen on aging ranches." It was the calm way she said it that chilled me. She was not describing risks. She was listing possibilities. I closed the gate between us. "Then I suggest you stay on your side of the fence. Because if anything suddenly happens on this ranch, I will know exactly where to start looking." They left without another word, but the paper attack began before sunset. I received notices about water runoff, fence height, unauthorized livestock density, invasive vegetation, and failure to preserve scenic compatibility. One letter claimed my windmill produced excessive visual disturbance. Another demanded an engineering inspection of my barn within 10 days. The county planning department notified me that Briar Glen had requested temporary access to investigate potential soil contamination. They were building a file thick enough to make theft look like public service. I spent 2 days answering every notice, photographing every fence, testing the creek water, collecting maintenance records, and requesting the personnel history of anyone connected to the altered plat. The work was exhausting, and that was the point. They wanted me tired, frightened, and buried beneath deadlines until signing Preston Vale's contract felt easier than resisting. On the third night, I sat alone at the kitchen table with Ellen's old reading glasses beside my papers. She had always been better at seeing the shape of trouble before I did. "You were looking at the noise, Walter," She would have said, "Find the hand making it." So I stopped reading violations and started studying timing. The fake survey had been filed 6 days before Northstar announced Section 6 to investors. The environmental petition came one day after I rejected Preston's offer. The HOA fines were generated less than an hour after Vivian left my gate. Every action depended on the assumption that they could enter my land, plant evidence, move markers, or create the appearance of neglect. That was the hand. They did not need to beat me in court if they could manufacture the facts before we got there. My father had taught me that a fence was not just wire, it was information. A broken strand told you where an animal pushed through. Bent grass told you which direction it traveled. Mud carried a better memory than most witnesses. I went to the equipment shed and pulled down 4 trail cameras, 2 motion lights, a thermal sensor, and a small container of ultraviolet tracking powder I used around feed bins when I suspected raccoons. Under daylight, it looked like ordinary gray dust. Under a UV lamp, it glowed bright blue. I mounted cameras inside hollow fence posts, angled one toward the irrigation shed, and buried a sensor near the shallow drainage cut behind the barn. Then I dusted the low crossing beneath the south wire, the place a person familiar with the ranch would choose to avoid the gate. I did not tell Jeanette, the sheriff, or my neighbors. I wanted whoever came next to believe I was still an old man drowning in paperwork. At 12:37 that night, the receiver beside my bed chirped. Amos lifted his head before I did. On the monitor, 2 figures in dark clothing slipped beneath the south fence. They moved quickly and without flashlights, one carrying a canvas tool bag, the other holding a bundle of metal stakes. They crossed directly toward the north pasture, which meant they had either studied aerial photographs or been there before. The taller figure knelt beside an original cedar marker and drove a new steel pin almost 20 feet inside my property. The second person attached a laminated tag labeled Briar Glen Section 6 Boundary Control Point. Then they moved toward the irrigation shed. One opened the tool bag and removed a small plastic bottle and a hand auger. I could not tell what was in the bottle, but I knew exactly what they wanted the county to find in my soil. I waited until both of them stepped into the drainage cut, then triggered the floodlights. The pasture turned white as nude. One figure fell backward. The other dropped the bottle, cursed, and ran toward the fence. Amos barked so hard the kitchen windows rattled. They crawled beneath the wire, dragging their gloves, knees, and coat hems through the tracking powder, then disappeared into the trees where a vehicle started without headlights. I replayed the footage 3 times. On the 4th viewing, I paused when the taller trespasser turned toward the camera. The hood hid most of the face, but a gold bracelet flashed on the wrist, wide and polished, with a distinctive black stone in the center. I had seen that bracelet less than 12 hours earlier when Vivian Sloan handed me the violation folder. By sunrise, I had photographed 10 false boundary stakes, recovered the dropped bottle, and found a folded development map beneath the irrigation shed door. The map carried a county review stamp and showed 42 homes, a private lake, and a sales pavilion spread across my pasture. Attached to it was an internal Northstar memo estimating expected revenue at $21 million. I finally understood why they had stopped asking. They had borrowed against that money, spent part of it, and promised the rest. My land was not merely part of their plan. It was the piece keeping their entire scheme from collapsing. I copied the video, sealed the bottle without opening it, printed the filings, and wrote one sentence across the top of the evidence packet. You purchased development rights from people who never owned them. Then I drove to Northstar's regional office, walked past the receptionist, and placed the package directly into the hands of their general counsel, a quiet man named Samuel Reddick. He looked at the forged plat, watched 30 seconds of the night footage, and lost every trace of color in his face. "Mr. Cade," he said, "how many copies of this exist?" "Enough," I told him. That answer seemed to frighten him more than the video. He asked me to wait while he called the company's chief executive. I stood instead. "You have until the hearing next Thursday to decide whether Northstar was deceived by Briar Glen or helped deceive everyone else." Samuel glanced at the sealed bottle. "What is that? Something your partners intended to bury beside my irrigation line?" He looked through the glass wall toward a conference room full of executives, then back at me. "Mr. Rice, there a modus. Cade, you understand this could become a criminal matter." I put on my hat. It became criminal the moment they crossed my fence. When I returned home that evening, a court summons was waiting on my porch. Briar Glen had filed for an emergency injunction claiming I was obstructing survey access and threatening community representatives. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning before Judge Nolan Mercer, and attached to the filing was a sworn statement from Vivian Sloan declaring that neither she nor any HOA employee had ever entered my property without permission. I read that line twice, then reached into my pocket and turned on the small ultraviolet flashlight I had bought in town. The faint dust on the recovered map lit up blue beneath my hand, and suddenly I knew exactly how I was going to introduce Vivian Sloan to the truth. Thursday morning arrived under a hard gray sky, the kind that makes every courthouse window look colder than it is. I wore my cleanest denim shirt, the dark jacket Ellen bought me for our 40th anniversary, and the same boots Vivian had probably described as evidence of agricultural decline. Amos stayed home, though I will admit he had better judgment than half the people who walked into that courtroom. Briar Glen came prepared for theater. Vivian sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit, her hair pinned perfectly, that gold bracelet resting on her wrist like it had never been dragged through red Oklahoma dirt. Preston Vale sat 2 chairs behind her, whispering to North Star executives, who looked as if they had not slept since I delivered my evidence packet. Her attorney, Martin Kessler, was a thin man with silver glasses and the nervous habit of smoothing his tie every time he told a lie. He opened by describing me as an increasingly hostile landowner who had interfered with lawful planning, intimidated survey crews, and created dangerous obstacles along an emergency corridor. According to him, Briar Glen was not trying to seize my ranch. They were trying to protect future residents from environmental hazards and preserve access for first responders. It sounded noble, almost patriotic, until you remembered the part where they had sold 42 homes on property they did not own. Judge Nolan Mercer listened without expression, one hand resting near his chin. When Kessler finished, the judge looked at me. Mr. Bull, Cade, you are representing yourself today? Yes, sir. Do you understand the risks of doing that? I do. And you still wish to proceed? I looked at Vivian, more than ever. A few people in the gallery laughed quietly. Vivian did not. I began with the oldest survey I owned, the one my father commissioned in 1962, then moved through tax records, grazing permits, insurance documents, water tests, maintenance photographs, and current satellite images showing active use of every section they had called abandoned. Jeanette Crowley testified that the altered boundary filing had entered the county system under the name Harold Cade, a person she could not verify through property, tax, birth, or probate records. She also confirmed that the survey seal belonged to Lowell Brandt, whose license had been revoked. Kessler objected so often that Judge Mercer finally removed his glasses and said, Mr. Kessler, if you interrupt one more answer before the witness finishes it, I will assume you are afraid of what she's about to say. That bought us several peaceful minutes. Then Kessler presented Vivian's affidavit. She took the stand and spoke in the careful, wounded tone of someone performing innocence for a room she believed was already hers. She denied authorizing any trespass. She denied knowing the boundary documents were false. She denied seeing the anonymous letter, the altered plat, or the night visitors. When asked about the HOA's motivation, she folded her hands and said, "We were trying to create homes for families." Mr. Cade turned a routine development matter into a personal war. I stood slowly. Mrs. Sloan, did you ever enter my property after I refused your inspection request? No. Did you direct anyone else to enter it? Absolutely not. Did you meet with anyone who entered it? Not to my knowledge. Her bracelet caught the courtroom light when she lifted her hand, that black stone flashing once. I asked the clerk to play the trail camera footage. The room went silent as the 2 hooded figures appeared on the screen, crossed beneath my fence, planted false markers, and carried the bottle toward my irrigation shed. When the floodlights came on, the taller figure raised an arm to shield the face. The gold bracelet shone clearly. Vivian's hand moved beneath the table. I saw it, and so did Judge Mercer. Kessler stood. Your Honor, jewelry is not identification. Plenty of people own gold bracelets. I nodded. He is right. That was when Vivian's shoulders relaxed just a little. Then I placed the recovered map in a clear evidence sleeve and asked the bailiff to lower the lights. Judge Mercer leaned forward. Mr. Cade, what exactly are you doing? Demonstrating where the map came from. Sir, I switched on the ultraviolet flashlight. Blue streaks burst across the plastic, along the edges, over the fold, and beneath one corner where a thumb had pressed hard against the paper. Then I swept the light across the evidence photograph showing the contaminated crossing and the glowing trails left by the trespassers. Kessler shook his head. This proves nothing about my client. Maybe not, I said, turning toward Vivian, but her affidavit says she never entered my property and never came into contact with anyone who did. I asked the judge for permission to examine the hem of her trousers and the underside of her bracelet. Vivian stood so abruptly her chair struck the wall. I will not submit to some humiliating stunt. Judge Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Affor Sloan, you submitted a sworn affidavit. Sit down. The bailiff closed the courtroom doors. Vivian's confidence disappeared in pieces. First the smile, then the posture, then the controlled breathing. When the UV beam passed over the lower edge of her trousers, a blue stain appeared near her left ankle. Another line glowed across the underside of her bracelet. The gallery erupted. Kessler asked for a recess. Judge Mercer denied it. Vivian stared at the stain as though it had betrayed her personally. I did not feel triumphant then. Not exactly. I thought I would. Instead, I felt tired, because there is something sad about watching a person discover that power does not make facts disappear. Judge Mercer turned to her. Would you like to revise your testimony? Vivian looked at Kessler. He would not meet her eyes. Then the courtroom doors opened and Samuel Reddick walked in carrying 2 banker boxes. Behind him came a state investigator and a representative from the county district attorney's office. Samuel addressed the judge. Northstar Residential Partners is withdrawing from every agreement connected to Briar Glen Section 6. Our internal review found that the association accepted deposits, represented control of the Cade property, and used falsified land documents to secure financing. We are cooperating with criminal investigators and reserving all claims for fraud and damages. Preston Vale lowered his head into his hands. Vivian said nothing. Samuel placed copies of emails, financial transfers, and board minutes on the clerk's table. One email from Vivian instructed a contractor to create visual evidence of disuse before the county inspection. Another referred to me as the last obstacle and suggested that soil irregularities might accelerate condemnation. The plastic bottle recovered from my irrigation shed was later confirmed to contain a petroleum-based contaminant. They had planned to poison my soil, report the damage, and blame the condition of the ranch. Judge Mercer dismissed the injunction, awarded every Briar Glen filing connected to my property, and issued an immediate order barring HOA officers, contractors, and developers from entering within 500 feet of my boundary without written permission or a lawful warrant. Then he looked directly at Vivian. Mrs. Sloan, you should understand that this court is forwarding the record for investigation of perjury, attempted evidence fabrication, criminal trespass, fraud, and conspiracy. She did not collapse or scream. People like Vivian rarely give you that satisfaction. She simply sat very still while the world she had controlled began moving without her permission. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps. I slipped through a side door and drove home alone. By sunset, workers were removing the Briar Glen Section 6 billboard. Within 2 weeks, the project was suspended, the association board dissolved, Preston resigned, and Vivian was charged. Though her attorneys immediately insisted she had only acted under pressure from developers, some residents blamed her. Others blamed Northstar. A surprising number blamed me for destroying a project that would have raised their property values. One man told a local reporter that I should have accepted the offer for the good of the community. I wondered whether he would say the same thing if the community had chosen his house instead. On Sunday evening, I saddled my mare, June, and rode the entire fence line. The false stakes were gone. The orange flags were gone. The cedar posts remained, weathered and crooked, but still holding. I stopped beneath the cottonwood where Ellen was buried and told her the whole story out loud, including the part where I made a lawyer sweat through a shirt that probably cost more than my first truck. The wind moved through the grass, and for 1 second I could almost hear her laugh. As darkness settled over the pasture, the motion lights came on one by one behind me, not like alarms anymore, but like porch lamps guiding a man home. The line had held, though I understood something then that I had not understood before. A boundary is never only about dirt. It is about how much power we allow people to claim simply because they arrive with polished shoes, official language, and enough confidence to make theft sound reasonable. So tell me what you think. Was I right to destroy an entire housing project to protect land that had been in my family for generations? Or should one man be expected to sacrifice his home when hundreds of other people stand to benefit? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Share this story with someone who has ever been pushed around by an HOA or developer. And subscribe, because sometimes the only thing standing between a bully and everything you love is the moment you finally decide not to step aside.